I'm Audrey Foster with Nebraska Extension in Custer County, and I'm their summer employee. Today, we're going to be exploring the nuances of beginning sewing in our So Cool in the Summer workshop. So today, we're going to be learning the basic tools we use for sewing, then we're going to be moving into rotary cutter safety, and then we're going to try a couple of basic sewing projects. And these projects can be a great refresher for first year, second year, or even third year sewers. Or if you're a very experienced sewer just looking to switch things up before you begin your sewing for the year. So the different projects that we're going to be creating today include a neck cooler and a phone charging case. And as you can tell, they're kind of fun to make, so I've made a few different types. I look forward to seeing what each of you create. To begin, we're going to learn about some of the basic sewing notions that you'll use very frequently while you're sewing. When you're identifying which tools you need, it can be useful to consult your STEAM 1 manual, especially on page 12, where it starts to go over each of these tools in depth. The first thing you're going to need is a box or some type of a case to store all of your sewing stuff. I got this when I first started sewing, and as you can see, this is actually a tackle box you'd use for fishing. So just about anything can work. I actually really like this because as you notice the flat shape, it's really easy to throw in a bag and transport anywhere. So whatever type of container you can find can work. We're gonna start with our cutting tools you'll use while you're sewing. First of all, you have your dressmaker shears. As you notice, these are flat along one side, and this allows for easy cutting of fabric when you're cutting along a flat surface. Also, it's nice to have paper scissors because you should not ever mix these up. You have your paper ones and your fabric ones, because if you cut the wrong material with each of them, it'll dull them. Also, I know these two look very similar, so you guys should get ones that are a little more distinctive. I've worked with each of them enough that I can tell them apart based on their weight. Then we also have our little thread scissors, and as you can tell, these are pretty little scissors, and these don't necessarily have to be anything fancy. A lot of times I'll use old school scissors for this actually. So these are just little scissors to cut thread. You'll also have a seam ripper, and as much as I hate to admit it, you'll get way too familiar with this tool over the years. It's just a little tool that helps to rip out seams that you don't like. As you can see, there's a handle on it, but then there's also these two little hooks. And inside those two little sticks, there's a little blade right in the inside, which will cut the stitches. Okay. Also, the final tool that you may or may not use is a rotary cutter. And we'll have more on the safety of these to come because they're a very useful tool, but they can be a little tricky to use as well. Next up, we have our measuring tools. We have 60-inch tape measures and a little seam gauge. We also have tracing materials, such as I always like to have a pencil handy and ready in case I need to mark anything. You can also use tracing paper and a tracing wheel. This tracing wheel is just a device where you see the end has these little prongs on it to mark using the paper. And then I also like to have various marking things present, such as tailor's chalk or other types of marking pencils. You will also be using various thread and bobbins. As you can see here, I have a plastic bobbin and a metal bobbin. It matters which kind of bobbin you use depending on your machine. Make sure to consult your manual before using bobbins because you need to use the correct type. I have one type that I use with my machine here at home and one that I use with a different machine, so I have to have both, but I need to keep them separate. I also have a little needle threader here, which can be helpful when I'm having a difficult time threading my needles. Now, as far as pinning tools go, I have my needles for my sewing machine. I have my normal needles and my needle book, which is a little bit messy right now. I also have a pin cushion and regular pins. I have some safety pins. And then I have two different types of thimbles. This type of thimble I can use when I'm hand sewing, and this type of thimble I use when I'm ironing because it's heat resistant. This one's not, but this one is. So these are just some of the basic tools that you'll want to put in your sewing box and have handy whenever you're sewing. Typically, if we were learning to sew in person, we'd look at each of your machines and identify each of the different parts. but as this is virtual this year, that's a little bit trickier to do. However, I encourage each of you to consult your STEAM 1 manuals, especially page 34, where it starts to go over each of these different parts of your machine, as well as the different pages of diagrams to follow. This can be super helpful, and also make sure to talk with an adult or else look at the sewing machine manual when you're starting to work with the machine, because although they're very cool, useful machines, they can have a lot of nuances and tricky parts to them as well. So make sure that you talk with someone so that you know what you're doing. If you've never sewn before, or if it's been a little bit since you've sewn, it may be helpful to practice sewing on the machine with paper. So when you use these paper guides, you can find these in the comments below. What you do is you take an old needle, an old sewing machine needle, and you unthread your machine. Then you can practice stitching along each of these lines with the paper. And so then this just kind of helps you to relearn how to sew straight and just gives you some good practice on something that doesn't necessarily count. Also in the comments below, typically at beginning sewing workshops, we would be making pillowcases. And so I've uploaded the instructions for the burrito pillowcase method below as well, in case you want a different challenge, and the instructions include both words and pictures. If you have any questions, please reach out to us at the Extension office. So today, before we begin, I want to go over a little bit of safety revolving around our rotary cutters. So rotary cutters are an excellent tool when you're cutting out shapes such as rectangles, triangles, or squares, and they can be super helpful and quick, but we need to make sure that we're using them safely, and this may involve having a parent present. Okay, so a few things to begin with is a rotary cutter is this little tool here, and it has that circular blade. There's normally a button on it that you can push out, and then it sets the blade out of the device. And then there's a little safety button on the other side that you can push, and then the blade retracts. This makes it so that it's safe to handle when you're not using it, but you have to push the blade out in order to be able to use it. When you're using this, you only want your blade to be pressed out when you are actually cutting. So if I'm cutting a whole bunch of pieces and I've cut one and I'm gonna set this down so I can readjust my fabric, you need to make sure to retract the blade, because otherwise if you'd set it down on your mat, you could accidentally cut yourself when trying to rearrange your fabric or when you went to grab it. Also, when we're using our rotary cutters, a lot of times we have to use a mat. This mat protects our surfaces from getting different types of marks, and then it just helps it cut easier as well. You will also use a ruler, and this serves as a guide, but it also serves as a form of protection. When you're using this, what you'll do is you'll line it up with where you want to cut, you'll hold it in place with one hand, and you'll cut with the other hand right along this ruler. You never want to put your hand over the ruler. You want to make sure that it stays on this side, or else you could accidentally cut your fingers. Make sure you're always aware of where your fingers are and where your helper's fingers are too. So for our neck cooler, the first step is to cut a 4-inch strip of fabric that is 44 by 45 inches long. So my fabric is naturally, if it's cotton like this, is naturally 44 by 45 inches long. And you can measure it with a tape measure just to be safe, and like I've already done with mine. So it's 44 by 45 inches long, which is one of the dimensions we need, but the other dimension we need is 4 inches. So I'm gonna go ahead and cut that here on my rotary cutter. So I've just kind of doubled over the layers to make it easier to cut. And I'm gonna line this up so that there's a straight edge closest to me. And also, where this is just a little practice project, it's okay to use plaid, but remember that plaid is not okay to use in your STEAM 1 projects because it can be rather difficult to match up. This is just the fabric that I had on hand today. Cutting that is kind of like a grid or like graph paper. So I'm just lining it up along there, and my one edge over here isn't completely even. So my first step is gonna be to make sure that all those edges line up perfectly. So I've lined it up against this bottom edge, and now I'm gonna set my ruler down. And it doesn't necessarily matter which line I'm at, because I can count squares too. I don't have to make sure that this says 0 and this says 4 or anything. Okay, now Okay, and one other thing I forgot to mention is you're always gonna cut away from yourself. Never cut towards yourself because you could accidentally slip and cut yourself. So always cut away. Okay, as you noticed when I was cutting, I went straight. I did not go back and forth because that would create kind of jaggedy edges. Once we've cut our section, it should nicely just pull away. So now that we've got 2 straight edges, we're gonna go ahead and cut a 4-inch section of fabric. So like I said, I can count out my 4 squares. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I'm gonna line up my ruler on both ends. So I'm just making sure that this line goes straight across. And once again, I'm gonna make another cut. After I've made that cut, I can just pull it away, and there is my strip of fabric, so I'm ready to begin sewing. Also, as you can tell, this doesn't take much fabric. So these are something that you can make for friends or for gifts or just for something for fun during the summer. My next step is going to be to take my long strip of fabric and to fold it in half lengthwise with right sides together. And then I'm gonna pin along the edges. So I'm just gonna go ahead, and if you see, I have a wrong side of my fabric and a right side. If you guys, and you can determine this, but I like to have my bright side on the outside. So we're just gonna fold this in half, and then I'm gonna pin it. When I pin, I like to make it so that the heads of the pins are the little stops on the top, so that those are facing outward. So, as you can see there, I've put my pin so that it's facing toward the outside. This makes it easier to grab when I'm pulling it out while I'm sewing. Okay, so there's 1, 2, and then I'm gonna pin this whole length like that. Now I've gone ahead and pinned my raw edges together. So my raw edges are these rough edges that have been cut. This edge that's folded is called my folded edge, but I folded my 2 raw edges together and I've pinned along the whole length of that. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and sew along these raw edges at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. However, as we're making the neck coolers, we need to make sure that we leave an opening so that we can put our little beads inside. And so what I'm gonna do for that is I like to take a cluster of pins because I think, Audrey, why is there a cluster of pins there? And then I know to stop. And so, or start and stop. So I'm gonna put a cluster of 3 pins right here, and I'm gonna put a cluster of pins about right here. This opening only needs to be about 2 or so inches, 2 to 3. Okay, and so what I'm gonna do now is we're gonna start sewing in backstitch. We're gonna sew here, pivot, then we'll sew down here, backstitch. We'll take our strip out of our machine, and then we'll put it in right back here. Then we'll have an opening because we'll have a break in our sewing. We'll backstitch, then we'll sew this whole length till we get to the corner. Then we'll pivot again, then we'll sew over here and backstitch. So now let's go ahead and get started. As you can see here, I've gone ahead and lined up my fabric at a 1/2 inch. So right here, there's a 1/2 inch marking, and I've gone ahead and lined my fabric up right there. Then what I'm gonna do is, you notice I have my fabric in the machine, my presser foot's down. I'm gonna lower my needle, and then I'm gonna start sewing. And I'm just gonna make sure this stays right around a 1/2 inch. So now that I've taken a few stitches, I'm gonna go ahead and backstitch. For me, it's pressing this button right here, but it'll be different on each of your machines. Okay, and after I've backstitched, I'm just gonna continue stitching forward. And I wanna be careful never to sew over my pins. So I just keep my pin cushion right here handy so that then I can continue sewing. If you hit a pin, it can accidentally break your needle or bend pins or make your parents mad, so yeah, we just don't want to do that. Okay, and then to pivot, you see we're getting close to this edge, and we don't want to sew off of it, we want to pivot. So a pivot is like a pivot with basketball or modeling. And I'm gonna go ahead and lower my needle with my hand wheel over here. So as we mentioned earlier, we always move this towards us. We never move it away because that can knot our machine, always towards us. Okay, so I've lowered my needle. Then I'm gonna go ahead and lift up my presser foot, and I'm gonna pivot my fabric. So our needle's acting as our foot that stays planted when we pivot with basketball or modeling, and our fabric acts as our other foot that's able to turn. And I'm gonna line it up with 1/2 inch. I'm gonna lower my presser foot, and I'm gonna continue sewing. Same as before. Okay, and now I see those 3 pins approaching, so do you remember what that means? That means that I need to stop and backstitch. So I'm gonna go ahead and take those out because once again, we do not wanna sew over our pins, especially a cluster of 3 like that. I'd probably hit one. Okay, there we go. I'm just gonna sew up to where they were, then I'm gonna backstitch. Okay, then I'm gonna go ahead and lift up my presser foot, take this out of my machine, cut my threads, and I'll go back and deal with those later, but I'm gonna go ahead and line up my fabric about 3 inches away. Put my presser foot down. Oh, doesn't look like I'm quite lined up there. There we go. Oh, there we go. Not sure if I showed you guys that well. Gonna take out my cluster of 3, and I'm gonna go ahead and start sewing. And I'm gonna backstitch. And then I'm just gonna continue sewing for the whole length of this fabric. Don't forget to pivot at this other corner, and if you need to, feel free to back up this video as a reminder of how to pivot. Good luck sewing! Now that we've sewn along this whole edge, what we're gonna do next is we're gonna trim our seam allowances to 1/4 inch. So essentially what we're gonna do is we're just gonna cut our seam allowances in half, because remember, our seam allowance should be 1/2 inch, but we want them to be trimmed to 1/4 inch. So we're just gonna cut them about in half, and what we're gonna do for our corners is we're gonna cut across them like this. I've gone ahead and trimmed all my seams. Notice how one is cut a little bit shorter than the other one, and I've clipped straight across each of my corners. Now we get to turn it right side out. There are a variety of ways that you can turn your tube right side out, but I like to use my turn it all just because I think it goes a little bit quick. Otherwise, you can just turn it out by hand or any other method. So how I use this is I have a straw-like tube, and then I have kind of like a stick. And what I do is I am going to insert the straw-like tube into my tube of fabric. So once again, this is where it's useful that we have that opening, otherwise we wouldn't be able to turn it right side out. And I just push this all the way to the end, and then I take my stick and I push my fabric into the tube, and then it turns pretty quickly. And then I find my opening again right there, and there's where my stick and tube are, and then I just pull this through, just like that. And then I just have to flip this other little end and just push the stick-like part of it out. I think this tool is super handy and super easy to use, so I love it. Oh, one other thing. While this is still in there, we need to make sure to press out our corners too, because we want those to be nice and sharp. However, when you're pushing out your corners, you want to make sure that you don't accidentally poke through your fabric, because that would not be good. And it would inhibit the integrity of your nut cooler. Okay, then I can just turn this other little end out by hand. There we go. And then I can sharpen my corners with, you can also use a point turner for this, or all sorts of other tools. I would I know that your scissors or shears have a very nice point to them, but I'd stay away from using your shears to point out corners, because a lot of times they'll accidentally poke through. And, okay, now that it's all turned right side out, we gotta go press it. So I've got my iron all heated up, and I'm gonna go ahead and press this flat with my seam line. If you can see it right there, my seam line is gonna be pointed towards one edge. So if I kind of roll this between my fingers, I can get that seam line on one edge. And then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my iron and I'm going to press it. When we press, how we go about that is we take our iron and we press. Ironing is when you go back and forth, but pressing is just up and down, which is gonna be what we're doing today. So I've gone ahead and rolled my seam to the outside, and then I'm gonna press it. And I think that it's helpful to do this in little increments versus a huge long chunk at once. it can also be helpful to kind of roll this and then pin it before you press it, because that helps keep it where you want it positioned even better. So, and once again, the steam from this iron can be very hot, so you may want to have an adult present and just be very careful around it, because I don't want you guys to accidentally burn yourselves. Now that I've got it pressed all nice and flat, I'm gonna go ahead and find the center of my net cooler. And I can do this by folding it in half, and I know that right here is my center where it's folded. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna measure 7 1/4 inches from there and make a mark. So I'm gonna use my tape measure for this. I'm gonna measure out 7 1/4 inches, and I'm gonna make a mark with my pencil. You can use marking chalk or whatever shows up best on your fabric. Okay, and I'm gonna do this from on each of my sides. So 7 1/4. This is gonna be where we sew across it to keep our beads from just taking up the whole entire thing. So this is a marking line that we can sew across. So these are each marking lines, and these lines, once they're sewed across, they will hold the crystals in place when you pour them into the opening. So we need to make sure that we stitch completely across this entire length where I've marked. You can kind of see where I've marked there. Let's see, right there. And what we're gonna do is, once again, find your opening. Decide with that. Okay, there's my opening. So I'm gonna go to the one on the opposite end, because we're gonna be pouring our crystals through this opening. So I wanna sew across the opposite one, because if I was to sew across the one closest, then all my beads would just be in this little short tail. So I wanna sew across the other one, which is right here. And I'm gonna just sew right along my stitching line. And I'm gonna make sure I back stitch at both ends, and I wanna make sure that it's very, very secure. We'll stitch across the other one once our crystals are in. And now I'm gonna pour 7/8 teaspoon of soil moist crystals into the opening. And I wanna work all these crystals down okay, so I'm gonna pour them into this opening, and I wanna work them all down so that they're right by this far stitching line. I've gone ahead and poured 7/8 teaspoon of my water storing crystals into my net cooler, and I pushed them all down to this one end by my stitching. And so now I gotta find my other marking line right here, and I'm gonna stitch across there. I'm gonna stitch and back stitch, 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 stitch and back stitch. For the final step, we get to sew our opening closed. So if you guys can go ahead and find the opening where you poured your water storing crystals through, mine's right here. I've already gone ahead and gotten a needle with a thread attached, and I've tied a knot with both ends. There we go. And so what I'm gonna do is, starting on the inside of this opening, so here's my opening, I'm gonna take a little bite. This will hide my knot. So starting from the inside on one end, just taking a small little bite, and then I'll pull it through. And then it will hide my knot on the inside. Then we just take little bites this whole way along, just to ensure that our net cooler is stable. Okay, and when we get close to the end, we can go ahead and tie about 3 knots. So to tie knots, what you do is you go to take a stitch, but instead of tying it all the way tight, you will have this loop of fabric, or loop of thread, and you're gonna stick your needle through, and then you'll pull it tight. So once again, you'll take another little bite or stitch of fabric, and then when there's still a loop, you'll stick your needle through and pull it tight. And you'll want to do that about 3 times just to make sure it's secure. And then we can go ahead and clip our thread. And now it's done. You can go ahead and disperse your water storing crystals evenly and soak it in water for maybe an hour, and then your beads will get big and it'll be ready to use. Also, when you're done with it for the season, you can go ahead and just set it outside of water and let it dry up, and the crystals will return back to their hard bead type forms, and you can store it for next summer in a plastic bag. Also, if you store it in the fridge, that'll make it get really cool, which will be nice on very hot days. You can soak it in water as often as you like. To start out, we're gonna cut our fabric using our rotary cutters. When we use rotary cutters, remember to be very careful and to have an adult present just to make sure that you're using it safely and everything. So I've got my rotary cutter here, I've got my mat, and I've got my ruler. Also, I've got my polyester batting. You guys can also use fusible fleece here. I just didn't happen to have any on hand. I also have some scraps of fabric, and then once again, you can use fusible fleece if that is something you have on hand, or if you can go out and purchase it. I just don't have it right now. And then I also have pins to get started. I'm gonna go ahead and lay out this piece of fabric here, and for my first piece of to start out, I need 2 pieces of fabric that are 10.5 by 6 inches. I'm gonna measure out on this mat here. This mat is pretty cool because it's just pretty much like a graph paper. It's like a grid that I can measure on. So I'm gonna go ahead and measure out 10.5 inches. I'm making sure that all my edges are lined up so it's straight across the bottom with a line and it's straight over here with a line. Also, this is a good time to note that if you don't have a rotary cutter and mat and ruler, you don't necessarily have to go out and buy one. You could take a piece of paper and measure out these dimensions, cut out the piece of paper, then you could pin that paper onto your fabric and cut around it. That would do the same thing. Go. And then I'm gonna press down on my ruler here with some weight. And I'm gonna go ahead and push out my blade, and then I'm gonna slice my fabric. And when you slice your fabric, you don't necessarily want to go back and forth. You just want to make one clean swipe. So then your fabric will separate nicely. So then you can just pull it. Oh, and see, you notice how my blade was in, so I didn't get hurt there. So now I can just pull it apart. And so now I have my 10.5 dimension, and now I need to measure out my 6 inches. So I'm going to go ahead and turn this, and I'm going to measure out 6 inches. Just like so. And then once again, I'm going to use my rotary cutter to cut it. So now I can go ahead and pull those apart, and you can do both your front and the back of the case the same color, but I want to kind of make mine cool and do it 2 different colors. So now I'll follow that same process with my other fabric. Now that I've got both of my 10.5 by 6 inch pieces cut, I'm going to go ahead and cut 2 pieces that are 7 by 5 inches. And I'm going to use the same fabric. So I'm just going to repeat my method from before as far as measuring out 7 inches, then 5 inches, and cut using my rotary cutter. Next up, I'm going to be cutting my batting, but you guys could also use fusible fleece. I just didn't happen to have fusible fleece on hand. So with this, I'm not sure how well my rotary cutter would cut it. So I'm gonna go ahead, and I made sure that my safety's on, or my blade's within the device. And I'm gonna go ahead and set it aside. And how I'm gonna cut my fusible fleece or my batting is using a paper pattern that I have created. My paper pattern for this is nothing fancy. In fact, you guys can and will make these at home. What it is I just took old copy paper. You guys could use notebook paper or whatever kind of paper you have on hand. And I just measured out rectangles. This one is 10.5 by 6 inches. And this one is 7 by 5 inches. Oh, and so what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna pin each of these onto my batting, and then I'm gonna cut out around my rectangles. And I'm just gonna go ahead and pin around both of these. And if you don't have a rotary cutter, you could use this method for your fabric too. Now I'm just gonna cut out around these with my fabric shears. Now that we have all our pieces cut out, our first step is going to be to attach our batting or fusible interfacing to one of our fabric pieces. And so depending on if you use fusible interfacing, you'll iron it to your fabric to attach it, but as I have batting, if I iron it, it won't necessarily attach. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pin it to the back side of my fabric. Here's the right side of my fabric, here's the back side. I'm going to pin it to the wrong side or the back side of my fabric, and then I'm gonna sew around it at a narrow 1/4 inch seam allowance. So what's a 1/4 inch seam allowance? What I mean by seam allowance is the distance from my seam line to the raw edge of my fabric. And so how we can find these on our sewing machines is here's 1/8, here's 1/4 inch seam allowance. So it's really important to be aware of your fractions when you're finding these. And so what we're going to be doing once again is we're going to be attaching our batting to the wrong side of our fabric. And you can see I've kind of started laying them out here. And I'm going to sew around these at a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to baste them together. So what I mean by basting is that it's a longer stitch than what we'd normally use to sew. Okay. So I've gone ahead and pinned around the perimeter of both my pocket piece and the body of my holder. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go ahead and set up my machine for a basting stitch. So your machines will each be a little bit different with this, and you may either need to consult a parent or else your sewing manual. But for mine, what I'm gonna do is I go down to my stitch length. And if you see here, my natural stitch length is 2.2 for my machine, and I'm gonna take it to a 5. That's as high as my machine goes. And if you hear it here. And so then I know that that's the longest stitch for here, and so then I'm good to baste. Okay, and so then, as we mentioned before, we're gonna do a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So if you see here, if I have it right here, that's a 1/8 seam allowance. If I put it right here, that's a 3/8. So I want it right here to be at 1/4. And I'm gonna go ahead and line up my fabric, and I will show you what that looks like. So I have my fabric all lined up and ready to go. Notice I've put my presser foot down, and I'm gonna go ahead and put my needle down into my fabric. Okay, and then I'm just gonna sew this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And here we go. And we're sewing this at 1/4 inch, so then when we stitch our front to our back, you won't be able to see this line of stitching. It's just kind of holds these two layers together. Okay, getting close. And as you can see, we're coming to the end, but we don't necessarily want to be done sewing. So what we're gonna do is what's called a pivot. So we're gonna go ahead and finish out that stitch with our hand wheel. Our hand wheel, once again, is right over here, this one right here. Make sure that you always turn it towards you and never away from you. And so once again, I've sunk my needle down into my fabric. And it's a pivot because if you think about like a pivot with basketball or modeling, you keep one foot planted while the other one can move. Well, here, our needle's gonna stay planted while the direction of our fabric moves. Kind of like where your needle's acting like the foot that stays put, where your fabric's acting like the foot that can move. So as you've noticed, I just turned my fabric and it just stays put because my needle is submerged into it. Then once again, I'm gonna line it up at my 1/4 inch seam allowance, set my presser foot down, and I'm gonna continue to sew. So once again, that was what is called a pivot. And be careful to never sew over your pins. And you're just gonna keep doing that and go along the perimeter of your fabric. So we have 1 and 2 more pivots to go. Then you'll repeat this process on your other piece, rectangle of fabric. Next up, we're gonna be sewing the 2 pieces of our pocket together. So for this, I've taken my 2 pieces of pocket and I'm placing them with right sides together. This will make it so that then when we turn it right side out, we won't see this seam. So I place them with right sides together, and then I'm just gonna pin along the top edge. So at this point, depending on if your fabric has a design on it, mine's kind of non-directional, where it's just kind of flowers and lines, so it doesn't matter which direction it's going, but make sure that you watch it to see if yours does. And so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna go ahead and pin along this top long side, and then I'm gonna stitch along it at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I've gone ahead and pinned this. Now I'm gonna sew a straight line across here at 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm gonna backstitch at both ends. Now I've gone ahead and sewed this seam, if you can see it there. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna open this up, and I'm gonna fold it so that my right sides are out, and then I'm gonna press it with my iron. This next step is optional, but I think that it adds a fun, kind of decorative touch. And what I'm gonna be doing is adding ribbon to my pocket. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna measure down 3/8 inch from the top edge of this pocket that we just pressed. So I'm gonna measure down 3/8 and I'm gonna pin my ribbon. And I have my edge even. I can use my seam gauge to measure it. So I'm just gonna adjust my seam gauge to 3/8 inch. There we go. And then I'm gonna measure down, see that it's at 3/8. and place a pin. And I'm gonna do this the whole length of this. Okay, and now that I've pinned the whole way, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna take my shears and I'm just gonna clip off this extra. There we go. And now you're gonna get to practice sewing very, very carefully and very, very slowly along the edge of this ribbon. So as close to the edge as you can sew while still being on the ribbon, I'm just gonna have you stitch along that side and along the bottom. Now I've gone ahead and sewed on my ribbon, as you can see with my white thread. You guys will probably want to use thread that matches, but I'm using white so that it shows up, so that you guys can see where I'm stitching. And, oh, one other thing I forgot to mention. I stitched through both layers when I attached that ribbon, see? So then it holds my pocket in place. And so I have that line of ribbon, and then I think it'd be kind of fun if I added a bow. So I'm gonna do that here real quick too. So there I've gone ahead and added a quick little bow to the front of it. Once again, you don't have to do that. I just thought it'd be kind of fun. And your bow can look a lot different than mine. You could hand sew it on however you want. This is your project. Do it your way. This is just how I did mine. For this next step, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna be attaching my pocket to the body of my holder. But before I can do that, if you notice this, one is longer than the other by about an inch. So what we're gonna do is we're gonna take our seam gauge and I'm gonna take a 1/2 inch off each side. But it's not gonna be a straight 1/2 inch off both sides. We're gonna taper it. So what we're gonna do is I have my marking utensil here. I'm using a pencil. You can use anything except a pen. And what we're gonna do is I'm gonna measure over with my seam gauge 1/2 inch and make a little mark. I don't know if you guys can see that, but I'm just making an mark right there, and I'm gonna do the same with the other side. Made my mark. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna line my seam gauge up because it's a straight edge from my marking to this upper corner, and I'm gonna draw a straight line. There we go. And I'm gonna do that on both sides. Then I'm just gonna cut along those lines. There we go. And here we go. Okay, there we go. Then what I'm gonna do is I'm going to take the right side of my, let's see, I think I want this side to be showing. And I'm gonna go ahead and match up these bottom corners and this bottom edge here. So there we go. And as you see here, it matches up quite nicely. And I'm just gonna put pins in there because we're gonna be sewing along this whole thing. So there we go. And I always like to start with my corners just so it provides a little bit of stability as I pin the rest. And then, there we go. And then I'm gonna go ahead and match up my edges. And as you notice here, and on yours, the pocket kind of is bowing out a little bit, but that's okay because that'll provide plenty of room for your device as it charges, and the cord. So it's okay that it's kind of bulging out like that. So now I'm just gonna go ahead and sew around this at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I'm gonna pivot here at each of my corners, and I'm gonna backstitch at my beginning and end. And now I've gone ahead and sewed on my pocket. See there, you can see my stitching lines. And what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna attach my other piece of fabric to it. And this is gonna be the back of my charging case. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna just go ahead and with right sides together, I'm gonna lay them on top of each other, and I'm gonna go ahead and pin around it. So I've gone ahead and pinned around the perimeter of it, and I'm gonna stitch around this at a 3/8 inch seam allowance. And also another important thing to know is I've gotta be able to turn this right side out. So to be able to do that, I'm gonna leave a 2 inch opening here at the top. And so I've just placed a couple pins, but to make it more significant so that I know to start and stop there, I'm gonna put like a cluster of 3 or so pins here. And that's just to grab my attention, so then when I see that, I think, Audrey, what's going on there? And then I remember to either start or stop. So I will start here, I'll backstitch, then I'll pivot, 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 then I will sew all the way up here, pivot, sew over here, and backstitch. And then I'll be able to clip my corners and turn it right side out. Now that I've gone ahead and flipped it right side out, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna press it, and then I'm gonna very carefully hand sew this opening closed. Next up, I've gone ahead and placed my shower grommet onto my charging case, and I drew a circle around the middle opening of my case. I did this with a marking pen. So if you see here, I have my marking line, and I have the edge of my presser foot lined up with that marking line, and I'm just gonna stitch in a circle around there. Oops, a stitch in a circle around there, and this just kind of helps to stabilize my fabric. Now what we're gonna do is I've stitched around there, not my straightest circle, but it will be covered up by my grommet anyways, so we're just gonna check to make sure that our stitching line's covered, and as you can see, it is. And what we're gonna do now is I'm just gonna cut out that circle, and I'm gonna cut out slightly larger than it, but still within my line of stitching. So I'm gonna cut right about along there. So then it's between my stitching and my marking line, so that then it'll be covered by my grommet. So I've gone ahead and cut out that circle, and I'm just gonna test it to see if it's the right size. So I'm just gonna insert it there, and I'm gonna look at the back side to make sure there's enough room. It looks pretty good. So now I'm gonna take my back side, and I'm just gonna snap it into place. Let's see. Yeah. There we go. Now we're ready to go use it. It is completely finished. Now that we've finished up with our different tutorials for the day, I look forward to seeing what you guys come up with and how you guys spread this knowledge, either if it's through gifts or even by just telling friends and family about it. Once again, I look forward to seeing you next time. And I'm just gonna sew up to them where they were. Oh!